Greetings, hypothetical students, and welcome back to another episode of the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. Today we're going to be discussing the theme of money in Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. Now, before I get into talking about the books, a quick update on the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. I have unfortunately decided that I am not going to continue doing this series. This is sadly the last episode of the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course, at least for the foreseeable future. I've been running this series for about a year and every video is always late, and it's starting to feel like a chore because it takes up so much of my time. I really enjoy the actual filming of the video, but planning the videos and editing the videos and rereading very hefty books which I've read several times before to make the videos, books which I adore but where I could be spending that time reading other books, it's not really working for me. So I am sadly going to be stopping this series. I will talk about that more a little bit in a future channel update and also about what might be sort of replacing this series, but this is going to be the last episode of the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course, and I am sorry about that, but it's too much work, it's too much time. However, sad news over, I do want to talk about the theme of money in these two amazing books. So first, a quick introduction to both of these books. This is my favourite book ever by Charles Dickens, and this is possibly my favourite book by Anthony Trollope. I also adore The Small House at Allington, but this book is also absolutely incredible. And both of these books centre around a fortune, which is why I wanted to discuss the theme of money in them. Our Mutual Friend focuses on the Harmon fortune. A man called Mr. Harmon has made a giant, humongous fortune by making money from rubbish and dust, and effectively by sorting through a landfill site to see what things of value he can find there. At the beginning of the book he has just died and he's left the money to his son, but his son has been killed on the way back to England. And everything goes on from there and what happens with that fortune. And then in The Way We Live Now we have the Melmotte fortune. A new family called the Melmottes arrive in London. They have a lot of money, no one quite knows where it's got from, and everyone wants to see what they can make out of the Melmottes. So both of these books have a fortune at their centre and follow a lot of characters surrounding that fortune. So in the first half of this video, in the spoiler-free section, I'm going to talk a bit about money as a social pull and a kind of driving force in both of these books. I'll then talk a bit about money and power. I'll then talk a bit about the associations of money with rubbish and kind of dubious origins, and then I'll talk a bit about money and class, and then in the section with spoilers of this video I will talk a bit about money and marriage in these books, and then a bit about money and immorality, and then a bit about how the two endings of these books kind of present certain conclusions about money. So, let's start off by talking about money as a social pull and a driving force in both of these books. Both of these books, as I mentioned, are structured around a fortune, the Harmon fortune in Our Mutual Friend and the Melmotte fortune in The Way We Live Now. And in Our Mutual Friend, after the death of John Harmon, who was supposed to inherit this Harmon fortune, the fortune instead goes to the Boffins, who were the servants of old Mr. Harmon, and they are suddenly elevated into society and have all this money. And in both of these books, people flock to the Boffins and the Melmottes, despite disliking both of them. Both of these families, the Boffins and the Melmottes, are considered to not have the class to go with their money. They are considered vulgar. Mr. Boffin is referred to as the Golden Dustman, and Mr. Melmotte is constantly referred to as a scoundrel. And yet money is a vast social pull, and as I think one of the chapters in The Way We Live Now is called, everyone goes to them. People flock to these giant fortunes. And it's interesting to note how in both of these books, characters are very often motivated by money. I'll talk a bit later in the spoilery section about immorality and villains and money, because a lot of the villains, especially in Our Mutual Friend, pretty much all the villains save one, are motivated by money and not much else. And although there are not exactly strict villains in this book, a lot of the less savoury characters in The Way We Live Now are also motivated by money. And again, in the second half of the video, I'll talk a bit about marriage and money, because the motivation behind a lot of marriages made or thought about being made in these books is money as well. Money is the driving force behind so many of the characters in these books, and so many of the things they do are for money. If we think about the character of Bella in Our Mutual Friend, money is her main driving force in life. In the first chapter she appears, she says, "I love money, want it dreadfully." And later she says to her father, "I am the most mercenary little wretch that ever lived in the world. It's not that I care for money to keep as money, but I do care so much for what it will buy. I have made up my mind that I must have money, Pa. I feel that I can't beg it, borrow it, or steal it, and so I have resolved I must marry it. I have resolved, I say, Pa, that to get money I must marry money, in consequence of which I'm always looking out for money to captivate. I hate and detest being poor, and I won't be poor if I can marry money." Later she says, "Yet, Pa, think how terrible the fascination of money is. I see this and hate this and dread this, and don't know but that money might make a worse change in me, and yet have money always in my thoughts and my desires, and the whole life I place before myself is money, 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 and what money can make of life. That is the attitude of so many characters in both of these books. That is the attitude, to be honest, of Mr. Melmotte in The Way We Live Now. Money is a constant occupation for so many of these characters. In fact, I went on Project Gutenberg and did a quick search of the word money in both of these books. The word money appears 244 times in the book Our Mutual Friend and 722 times in The Way We Live Now. That's got to be a lot of instances of the words money. Money and issues of money is mentioned throughout both of these books, and in fact the openings of both of these books are occupied with money as well. The very opening of The Way We Live Now, we see Lady Carberry writing letters off to newspapers trying to get them to review her books in order that her book will sell better to get her money, and she's very calculating in the way that she writes these newspapers. Despite her high birth, she is being kind of impoverished by her son's terrible lifestyle, and throughout the book she constantly represents herself to especially the men of her acquaintance as being sort of poor, struggling to look after her family, desperately in need of money and assistance from those around her, which she is, but she also plays this up a lot. And then in the first chapter of Our Mutual Friend we start with Lizzie Hexam rowing her father out in a boat, and they've just picked up a dead body from the Thames with which they will get money. That is how he makes his money. He meets Rogue Riderhood, one of the villains of the book, when they are out on the boats, and Gaffer Hexam says to Riderhood he wants no more to do with him because he has been accused of robbing a live man, and Riderhood points out that they spend lots of time robbing dead bodies, and Gaffer Hexam says that this is absolutely fine, and we get a very important quote in the book, which is actually the quote on the back of my copy of Our Mutual Friend. Gaffer says, "Has a dead man any use for money? Is it possible for a dead man to have money? What world does a dead man belong to? T'other world. What world does money belong to? This world. How can money be a corpse's?" I want to talk a bit about money and power, because money is presented in both of these books as being quite powerful. At one point in Our Mutual Friend, Mr. Boffin tells his wife that we have got to recollect that money makes money as well as makes everything else. In The Way We Live Now, money is definitely presented as power. Melmotte has great social and political power because of his economic power, because of his money. At least for a time he is the most sought after person in London society. As Lady Carberry says to Mr. Melmotte, "What is there that money will not do?" And Mrs. Hurtle, an American in the book, says that she would much rather meet Mr. Melmotte than the Queen. We are told that Mr. Melmotte becomes greater and greater and mightier every day, and that money was the very breath of Melmotte's nostrils, and therefore his breath was taken for money. Melmotte's money brings people to him and it gives him power over people. And it's also important to consider not only that it gives him power, but that people think it gives him power, and therefore people are constantly wanting to get in with him, regardless of whether they know the extent and the source of his wealth. Throughout The Way We Live Now, there is constant talk of money, showing how money is such a preoccupation for people. Felix is constantly talking about money. He says a fellow can't live without some money in his pocket, and even Dolly Longstaff, who's presented as a very kind of clueless character, so unaware of the world, says it's always important to have a lot of money. In fact, the upper classes in The Way We Live Now are constantly pressed for money, and therefore obsessed with money. The Carberrys, the Longstaffs, the Melmottes. These families obsess over money. It's interesting, in Our Mutual Friend I would actually say that the importance and the power of money is shown much more by the significance of the lack of money than those people who are rich and kind of want to get more money. In The Way We Live Now, it's the upper classes who are always stressing about money, whereas the working classes in The Way We Live Now, like John Crumb and kind of Ruby's aunt in London, they don't seem to stress very much about money because they kind of seem to be okay in terms of the lifestyle they expect to lead. They have enough for it. Whereas in Our Mutual Friend, we see much more the danger of poverty and how the lack of money equals lack of power. We see this in families like the Hexams, and we see this in characters like Betsy Higdon, the way in which a lack of money restricts the lives of these characters. And yet I think it's interesting to see how in both of these books there is a limitation to the power of money. I'll talk much more about this at the end of this video, but at one point in The Way We Live Now, Marie Melmotte says, "What's the good of all the money if people don't have what they like?" This idea that actually the power of money is limited, and although these people within both of these books are trying to accumulate more and more money, they don't always actually get much happiness out of that money. And I think we see this in Our Mutual Friend as well, especially in terms of characters like the Boffins, and also because we do see in both of these books that money cannot buy everything, especially in terms of the way the Boffins and the Melmottes are looked down on because they don't seem to have quite the class of those around her. Money may be able to bring a lot of people into your house as guests, but it cannot necessarily make your guests respect you. I want to talk a little bit about the presentation in both of these books of money as being dubious or sort of connected to rubbish. In Our Mutual Friend, it is incredibly significant that the fortune at its heart has been made literally in rubbish and dust. Old Mr. Harmon was, as one of the characters puts it, a tremendous old rascal who made his money by dust. He's literally supposed to have made his money through landfill sites and through them being sorted through to get rubbish to make money. Like, he's literally made his money from rubbish, and the connection throughout this book of money with rubbish and dirt and dust and everything that is unsavoury and unpleasant is really, really fascinating and really, really important, and it's obviously a particular criticism of Victorian capitalism, I suppose. I might talk a bit later about the kind of corrupting influence of money in this book, but I think it's really important that Harmon's fortune does come from dust, and also that, as I already mentioned, the first money we ever see in this book is taken from the pocket of a dead man in the Thames. Money is presented throughout this book as being kind of dubious morally, and Melmotte's fortune in The Way We Live Now is presented as equally dubious. I have heard of the great French swindler who has come over here and who is buying his way into society. People said that Mr. Melmotte had a reputation throughout Europe as a gigantic swindler, as one who in the dishonest and successful pursuit of wealth had stopped at nothing. Roger says of Melmotte that he looks upon him as dirt in the gutter. And Georgiana Longstaff says, I believe the man to be a swindler and a thief, and I believe her to be anything low that you can think of. As for their pretensions to be gentlefolk, it is monstrous. The footmen and housemaids would be much better. Even Lady Carberry, who has quite a high view of Mr. Melmotte, is only willing to concede that he is as honest as men can be in such very large transactions. Mr. Melmotte is considered a hollow, vulgar fraud. And even beyond Mr. Melmotte himself, when Mr. Melmotte and the firm of Fisker, Montague and Montague set up this railway business and get people to buy shares, it's very clear that this is a dubious transaction from the beginning. And it's not presented as being illegal, but it's presented as being morally really, really dubious. From the very beginning, everyone knows that the object of Fisker, Montague and Montague was not to make a railway to veer a cruise, but to float a company. And Paul Montague is constantly worried that this might be dishonest. He finds it really hard to tell whether this is kind of in keeping with the way money works within Victorian society, or if this is in some way not acceptable and not okay and really dubious. I'll talk a bit later about the presentation of villains in both of these books and the association between immorality and money in that aspect. But first I want to talk a little bit about the presentation of money and class. The Boffins and the Melmottes in these two books are both incredibly rich, but neither of them are respectable. Both the Boffins and the Melmottes are considered vulgar because, as I've mentioned already in this video, they don't have the class, the birth, or the education to go with the wealth they have. They may be visited by people with titles, but those people do not consider these people their equals. They're just there because they want money. But in both of these books, the Boffins and the Melmottes are presented incredibly differently. In Our Mutual Friend, Dickens presents the Boffins without the birth and education of the upper classes as being morally superior in many ways to the upper classes. The upper classes in Our Mutual Friend are dissipated, bored, dishonest and constantly play acting. They're all kind of lying to each other all the time, and the idea of kind of playing a part and deceit is really important in this book. Whereas the Boffins, at least when we first meet them, are presented as being morally superior to the upper classes. They may not be considered to have as much education or as good breeding or manners as the upper classes, but they are presented as having more kind of morality and honesty. They are described as two faithful servants, honest and true. Mr. Boffin is regularly called the honest Mr. Boffin. And Mr. Boffin says himself that he and his wife are plain people, and we don't want to pretend to anything, or nor yet to go round and round at anything. They are presented as being much more honest than the rest of society, and for the most part presented as being kind of morally superior to those from the upper classes. In The Way We Live Now, I would say it is much more complicated. The Melmottes are definitely viewed as vulgar, but they're also definitely not morally superior to those around them. Not that many people in The Way We Live Now are morally superior to anyone, except for perhaps Roger Carberry, but the upper classes in this book, who have the birth to belong to the upper classes, and those who, like the Melmottes, who have got a lot of money in order to kind of be on a par with the upper classes but are socially beneath them, a lot of them are presented pretty badly, to be honest. It's very clear throughout this book that Melmotte doesn't really know how to behave. It's especially true when he at one point is in Parliament and tries to make a speech, and he keeps on doing everything wrong and breaking all of the conventions and the customs, and people are shocked because for them he kind of doesn't belong in that world if he can't behave in a way that fits in it. He's considered vulgar by everyone, and yet his money keeps people going to him. him. In The Way We Live Now, the Melmots are pretty awful, and everyone else in society is not above or below the Melmots, but pretty much as bad as the Melmots, however much they might not think it. That is it for the spoiler-free section of the video, so if you have not read these books, I highly advise you going off now, and I'm going to get into very spoilery territory. So now I want to talk a bit about money and marriage in these books, and the way that money and marriage interlink, because this is really, really interesting. I actually did my A-level coursework when I was 18. I wrote an essay comparing these two books and their presentation of marriage, and I talked a lot about money and marriage in both of these books, so it's quite nice to revisit this subject. In The Way We Live Now, Lady Carberry says to Hetta, "Love is like any other luxury. You have no right to it unless you can afford it." This suggestion that love is a luxury, that marriage for most people is about business, not about love, is very interestingly explored in both of these two books, and I want to look at a few characters in particular from these books to discuss their different attitudes. In The Way We Live Now, we have Hetta Carberry, who completely disagrees with her mother. She does not think love is a luxury that you don't have a right to unless you can afford it. She wishes to marry Paul for love, regardless of the greater wealth and comfort she would probably have with Roger, and the greater comfort her family might have if she were to marry Roger, because for her, love is important, and she does not think marriage ought to be about business. Even though she likes Roger very much, she thinks it would be a sin against herself, in a way, to marry a man she does not love. When we compare that to Georgiana Longstaff in The Way We Live Now, her only desire in marriage is to marry for an establishment. She only wants money. That's the only thing she cares about in marriage, is marrying someone who will give her money and a kind of social position. It's not about love. Although I do think it's worth noting that she's not exactly mercenary in the same way that someone like Felix Carberry is, because it's not just about wanting to marry for an establishment, it's also about just wanting to be married for kind of a future in life, because as a woman in that time you kind of don't really have a future or kind of independence of your own unless you marry. Unless she marries, she will have to live in her father's house her whole life, and she really doesn't want to do that. But she does expect an establishment and money, and in fact when her fiancé Birgit loses money, she is absolutely furious, because for her, marriage is entirely about the establishment and the provision of money. The passage in Mr. Birgit's letter which was the most distasteful to her was that which told her of the loss which he might possibly incur through his connection with Melmotte. What right had he to incur a loss which would incapacitate him from keeping his engagements with her? The townhouse had been a great persuasion, and now he absolutely had the face to tell her that there was to be no townhouse for 3 years. When she read this, she felt that she ought to be indignant, and for a few moments was minded to sit down without further consideration and tell the man with considerable scorn that she would have nothing more to say to him. When she writes to Mr. Beggot to tell her how annoyed she is that he doesn't have the money anymore to give her the house she wanted, he writes back and breaks off the engagement with her and says, "I may perhaps add that I had hoped you would have looked to your happiness to another source." For him, the marriage was not just a business deal, but for her, that is what it was. I think it's also very interesting to look in The Way We Live Now at the character of Mary Melmotte, because her position kind of changes quite a lot over the course of the book. As the daughter of Mr. Melmotte, she has potentially a vast fortune, and everybody therefore wants to marry her for her money. She has several suitors, including Lord Nitterdale and Sir Felix. Lord Nitterdale treats his kind of courting of Marie Melmotte as a business transaction sort of from the beginning, and it's pretty much arranged by his father. Whereas Sir Felix pretends to love Marie Melmotte because he knows that is the best way to go about it. He doesn't love her, he does view the potential marriage with her as a business engagement, but he pretends to love her for it. And Marie's view changes quite a lot over the course of the book. She desperately wants to marry Sir Felix when she is in love with him and believes that he is in love with her, but after she kind of becomes disillusioned with him, after she cannot marry the one man that she does love and knows that he doesn't actually love her, she begins to view marriage more as a business transaction. Later on in the book, she is perfectly willing to marry Lord Nitterdale, but she says to him, it's just as well for the both of us to look upon it as business. Even though at that point he is kind of slightly falling in love with her, and I've always thought that in The Way We Live Now, one of the most not heart-wrenching exactly, but one of the saddest things in The Way We Live Now is that Lord Nitterdale and Marie Melmotte could have probably been quite happy together if only things had been differently, and if only he had approached it differently from the beginning and Sir Felix hadn't been there. It makes me sad. I'm sad, but that's beside the point. I think it is very interesting to look at the person that Marie Melmotte does end up with, which is Fisker. Not necessarily someone you would expect her to end up with, not someone who she even meets till the end of the book. That is not a love match. That relationship between them is not satisfying because they are deeply in love with each other. That's not how it is. It is a kind of business partnership, but it is a partnership of equal terms. and that is why Marie ends up willing to marry him. She knows that Fisker probably wouldn't want to marry her if she didn't have some money, but also after her father's death, she herself has become an excellent woman of business and knows that it is in her interest as well to be married when she goes to America. And it's also incredibly important that Marie and Fisker go to America to be married, where in America the laws of women's property are quite different, meaning that, as Fisker says, I shouldn't be able to touch a dollar of your money. It would be a triumph to go into Frisco as man and wife. And we're told that Marie had opinions of women's rights, especially in regard to money. Yes, they enter into a kind of business partnership, but it is one of equal terms. They both kind of know what they're getting out from it, and Marie Melmotte keeps her money. It's very important that although she marries not for love, her money still remains her own. I want to talk a bit about Bella Wilfer in Our Mutual Friend. As I mentioned earlier, she starts off the book a bit like Georgiana in The Way We Live Now. She views marriage only as a way to find an establishment. She wants to marry money. For her, money and marriage are always intrinsically linked and have been from the beginning, because originally at the beginning of the book she is willed away like a horse, left in a will like a dozen spoons to John Harmon. And after the young John Harmon dies, her aim is to marry money. And she says that she is incredibly mercenary. And yet, she ultimately marries for love. She marries Mr. Rokesmith, who is poor. She marries him for love, and in fact, she marries him having defended him against Mr. Boffin when Mr. Boffin is furious that Mr. Rokesmith has proposed to Bella. Furious because Mr. Boffin says that all Bella needed was money, not affection. And because she sees the truth in Mr. Rokesmith's love, she therefore marries him and marries for love. It's interesting though that although she marries for love and gives up all potential possibilities of wealth in order to marry for love, Mr. Rokesmith is actually secretly John Harmon, and at the end of the book they do get their money. They do end up being incredibly rich. She marries the man she was originally willed away to, and although she married for love, not for money, she does end up being incredibly wealthy. It's interesting to look in Our Mutual Friend as well at the characters of Lizzie and Eugene, this kind of cross-class marriage that occurs at the end of the book, and the damnation of society and the way society views it. In the final few pages of the book, society debate Eugene and Lizzie's marriage and whether it is acceptable. One person suggests that there should be an equality of station and fortune in a marriage, and another is astounded that Eugene could possibly marry such a woman with her background without there being a lot of money. In what is one of my favourite lines in Our Mutual Friend, a man may do anything lawful for money, but for no money, bosh. But Dickens criticises this view incredibly strongly, instead presenting Eugene and Lizzie as a couple who love each other, who have kind of risen above these class boundaries. As Mr. Tremlow, who is Dickens's voice in this chapter, says, if this gentleman's feelings of gratitude, of respect, of admiration and affection induced him to marry this lady, I think he is the greater gentleman for the action and makes her the greater lady. I also think it's quickly worth looking upon the Lamleys as another great criticism for marriage for money and business. The Lamleys marry each other because they think the other one is very rich, and soon find out that neither of them are very rich at all, that they have both deceived each other, and they go on to hate each other and lead a terribly miserable fortune hunting life. So I think both of these books have quite different attitudes towards marriage and money. In Our Mutual Friend, the marriages made solely for money, like the Lamleys, are deeply, deeply unhappy, whereas the marriages made for love, such as Lizzie and Eugene and John and Bella, are happy marriages. Even though Bella does end up marrying the man she was originally willed away to, she doesn't marry him for money, she marries him when she has genuinely come to love him. And Dickens strongly criticises the idea that money should play a role in marriage, and certainly favours love marriages. Whereas I think in The Way We Live Now it's quite different. The only proper kind of love marriage, the only people who marry completely for love and not for money or sort of business in this book is Hetty and Paul Montague. And there are a lot of other marriages that occur in this book at the end of the book which take place not necessarily entirely for money, but at least for kind of convenience and comfort much more than for love. If we look at Marie's marriage to Fisker, or Lady Carberry's to Mr. Brown, or Ruby's to Mr. Crumb, or the fact that Mrs. Melmotte and Kroll randomly end up together at the end of the book, there are a lot of comfort matches in a way. They're not about love, they're not necessarily completely about money, but they're kind of about something in between. And now I want to talk a little bit about money and immorality in both of these two books. In Our Mutual Friend, the villains are all pretty much motivated by money, with the exception of Bradley Headstone, who is kind of a villain but also kind of not. Mr. Wegg, his main motivation for bringing down the Boffins is a desire for money, and possibly for slightly greater social status. Fledgeby, pretty much he just wants money. Riderhood, yeah, he kind of also just wants money. And the Lamleys, at least Mr. Lamley only wants money, and Mrs. Lamley really would quite like lots of money too, and also just doesn't want to be quite so mean about it as Mr. Lamley does. It's only really Bradley Headstone of potential villains who is not motivated by money, although interestingly he is undone by it. What pushes him over the edge in the end is not what he has done to Eugene, but the fact that Riderhood is blackmailing him and he just does not have the money to cope with it. In the way we live now, there are less clear-cut villains, but the less savoury characters in the book, such as Mr. Melmotte or Sir Felix, they are motivated pretty much exclusively by money. In both of these books, we have this idea that money is a kind of corrupting force. Money is presented as corrupting the boffins in Our Mutual Friend. Of course, it doesn't actually corrupt the boffins and they're just pretending and lying, but it is still presented as a corrupting force, and it is believable that it would corrupt the boffins, even though it actually doesn't. The Lamleys' desire for money makes them happy to do unscrupulous things. Mr. Lamley would pretty much do anything for money, and with Mrs. Lamley there is a line, but the line is still pretty low. At one point, Mrs. Lamley says to her husband, "If we could borrow money," and he says, "Beg money, borrow money, or steal money. It would all be one to us." And in the way we live now, money is presented as something entirely corrupting. Money is presented as naturally leading to crime, especially in the way that Mr. Melmotte's money works, especially in the way that his economic empire works. And in many ways, the way we live now kind of presents Victorian capitalism as a system which kind of naturally leads to dishonesty. Of Mr. Melmotte, he says that fraud and dishonesty have been the very principles of his life. And when Mr. Melmotte is finally brought to breaking point, Trollope writes, "Of course he had committed forgery. Of course he had committed robbery." That, of course, is really, really important, because he's not just saying, yes, Mr. Melmotte had done these things, but also, of course he had. It was natural for him to do these things because of the life and the career he had. I think it's also important noting not just how immorality and the desire for money are connected in both of these books, but also how renouncing money is considered a kind of heroic action. When Paul leaves the railway company in The Way We Live Now and rejects the dubious schemes that Melmotte is creating, it is considered a kind of heroic reaction, and it is one of the things that makes us really like Paul. Similarly, in Our Mutual Friend, John Harmon, our hero, is constantly casting off money. Before the boffins know who he is, he really doesn't want to come to life, as he puts it, because he doesn't want to take the money from them, because he believes that they deserve it. Similarly, it is important that Bella's moral transformation and her love for John are kind of symbolised in her renouncement of money. The moment of her kind of salvation when the boffins are writing her and she defends John is when she also rejects money. "Oh, Mr. Rokesmith, before you go, if you could but make me poor again. Oh, make me poor, somebody, I beg and pray, or my heart will break." Quickly before I go, I want to talk about the kind of endings and conclusions of both of these books. On the surface, Our Mutual Friend is a real critique of money, especially in relation to class. It shows money to be a kind of corrupting influence and a bad force. Money, in many ways, is kind of rejected in Our Mutual Friend and shown to be a rubbish, dubious, corrupting influence. The Way We Live Now is somewhat more complicated. Yes, it is a criticism of capitalism in many ways, but it's also kind of more realistic. It accepts the importance of money to material happiness and often to matrimonial happiness as well. That's on the surface, but also underneath there are more complicated issues going on. In Our Mutual Friend, money does bring happiness to a lot of people. It brings happiness to John and Bella, and money is kind of presented to this couple as a reward. However dusty and rubbish money may be, it still does bring happiness. There is a reason why Dickens chose that the money goes to John and Bella, not to the boffins, and we see throughout the book and throughout a lot of Dickens the dangers of poverty. Money is criticised, but its importance is recognised further under the surface. And similarly, while The Way We Live Now is often preoccupied with the importance of money, we also see how awful money can be. Mr. Melmotte is a horrible character, and his ending is so utterly indecent and unromantic. He kills himself while drunk. He doesn't even have control of his own ending. He may have power throughout the book, but he never has control of what he is doing. And despite all his money, his complete unkindness to his daughter and to everyone else around him is kind of what leads to his ruin. If he had been kinder to his daughter, she probably would have given him the money that was hers, and he might have been able to salvage the complicated, messy situation at the end. So although, to a certain extent, The Way We Live Now is more realistic and accepts the importance of money, it also really criticises it incredibly strongly, as does Our Mutual Friend. So I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the presentation of money in these two books. I do have 3 other books that I would like to recommend if you're interested in the theme of money in Victorian literature. One is Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Little Dorrit deals quite a lot with kind of Victorian venture capitalism, especially with a character called Mr. Merdle, who has some things in common with Mr. Melmotte to a certain extent, though he is a less unsavoury man. And then I would also like to recommend Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, another book that looks really interestingly at sort of the corrupting influence of money and also the differences between money and class. Pip, coming from a working class background, suddenly comes into these great expectations and goes on to be a gentleman, and the book is very interesting in terms of that. I'd also like to recommend Kips by H.G. Wells, which is one of H.G. Wells' non-science fiction books, and really, really interesting. And Kips is like Great Expectations, but what would actually happen if you gave someone from the Victorian working classes a lot of money and suddenly put them into a society where they didn't know what to do and they didn't belong. It's brilliant, really interesting to compare to Great Expectations, and one I would definitely recommend. So I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is sadly the last episode in the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. It's just not feasible for me to continue, but thank you for everyone who has watched it and enjoyed it and commented and so on. And yeah, please carry on reading Victorian literature. There will still be plenty of videos about Victorian literature on my channel, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.